They thought drowning Emma Rodriguez in bright red paint during her father's memorial service would finally destroy the quiet scholarship student who dared to dream of belonging at their prestigious university. Madison Pierce and her wealthy crew had spent months systematically dismantling every aspect of Emma's college life, using psychological warfare refined through years of practice on students they deemed unworthy. But when they cornered her in the empty parking garage that evening, expecting to watch another broken victim crumble under their relentless cruelty, they had no idea they were about to face 6 years of disciplined fury unleashed by someone who learned to fight in the same blue-collar gym where her hero father once trained. What happened next would not only change Emma's life forever, but transform the entire culture of Riverside State University in ways that Madison's family money could never undo. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had arrived at Riverside State University with one clear mission: earn her degree in emergency medical services, honor her father's legacy of service, and prove that a firefighter's daughter from the east side of town deserved to walk the same halls as students whose families endowed entire buildings. At 19, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that actions spoke louder than words, though her reserved demeanor often made classmates mistake her strength for shyness. Standing 5 feet 4 inches with shoulder-length dark hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, Emma dressed in simple jeans and secondhand sweaters that emphasized function over fashion, a choice that was partly financial necessity and partly deliberate strategy to avoid unwanted attention in an environment where designer labels served as social currency. Her dorm room in Heritage Hall was spartanly furnished with only the essentials needed for academic success: a sturdy desk where she studied late into the night, shelves lined with textbooks she had bought used and highlighted extensively, and a single framed photograph of her father in his firefighter's uniform, taken just weeks before the warehouse fire that had claimed his life when Emma was 13. What her roommate Sarah didn't know, what none of her classmates suspected, was that beneath Emma's bed lay a carefully maintained collection of boxing gear that told the story of a different kind of education, one that had taught her lessons about discipline, respect, and controlled violence that no university curriculum could provide. The local community had rallied around Emma's family after Captain Miguel Rodriguez died, saving 3 people from a collapsing building. But the scholarship fund that eventually paid for half of Emma's college education came with emotional baggage that she carried silently. Every semester when the financial aid office processed her paperwork, Emma was reminded that her presence at Riverside State existed because her father was dead, a reality that made her academic achievements feel simultaneously earned and undeserved. She had learned to navigate the complex emotions of survivor's guilt while maintaining the perfect grade point average that her scholarship required. But the psychological pressure of living up to a hero's legacy while proving herself worthy of opportunities he had died to provide created a constant undercurrent of stress that few people in her life truly understood. Emma had discovered boxing at 13, 3 months after the funeral, when her grief counselor suggested that physical activity might help her process the anger and helplessness that therapy sessions alone couldn't address. O'Brien's boxing gym occupied the basement of an aging community center 6 blocks from her childhood home, a place where the smell of leather and sweat, mixed with the sound of speed bags, and the patient voices of trainers who understood that fighting sports could teach young people how to channel destructive emotions into constructive discipline. Coach Mike Santos, a former Golden Gloves champion whose career had ended with a detached retina, had taken one look at the angry, grieving teenager and recognized someone who needed to learn how to fight for the right reasons. The first year had been about basics: proper stance, breathing techniques, fundamental punches thrown at heavy bags, until Emma's knuckles were raw, despite protective wraps. Coach Santos never mentioned Emma's father directly, but he spoke constantly about the connection between physical training and mental resilience, about how learning to absorb punishment while maintaining focus could prepare someone for challenges that had nothing to do with boxing rings. He taught Emma that real strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the discipline to protect what mattered, and that the most dangerous fighters were often the quietest ones who had learned to control their emotions completely before learning to control their opponents. By 15, Emma was sparring with partners who outweighed her by 30 pounds and winning regional amateur competitions against girls who had been boxing since elementary school. Her natural athleticism combined with an almost obsessive work ethic had transformed her from a grieving child into a technically proficient fighter whose mental toughness impressed even the veteran trainers who had seen hundreds of young athletes come and go. But Emma had made a conscious decision to keep her boxing career separate from her academic life, partly because she worried that her scholarship committee might view fighting sports as inconsistent with her medical career goals, and partly because she had learned that being underestimated was often more valuable than being feared. The boxing gym became Emma's sanctuary throughout high school, a place where her academic achievements mattered less than her willingness to show up every day and push herself beyond her comfort zone. Coach Santos and the other fighters created a surrogate family that helped fill the void left by her father's death, but they also instilled values that Emma carried into every aspect of her life: respect for opponents, humility in victory, grace in defeat, and the understanding that true power came from years of preparation rather than moments of violence. When Emma finally left for college, Coach Santos had given her a simple piece of advice that she carried with her every day. The strongest person in any room was usually the one who never needed to prove it. Riverside State University existed in a complicated social ecosystem that Emma had never fully anticipated, despite growing up just 20 minutes from campus. The institution served both local students whose families had worked blue-collar jobs for generations, and wealthy out-of-state students whose parents viewed a degree from Riverside as a stepping stone to more prestigious graduate programs or family business opportunities. This mixture created an environment where economic and social tensions simmered beneath the surface of campus life, occasionally erupting into conflicts that administrators preferred to handle quietly rather than address systematically. The university's most influential students operated within a network of family connections, legacy admissions, and donation-based privileges that created invisible but powerful hierarchies throughout campus organizations, academic departments, and social events. Madison Pierce represented the apex of this privileged ecosystem, a third-generation legacy student whose family's real estate empire had funded the construction of Pierce Memorial Library, and whose mother chaired the university's board of trustees. At 20, Madison possessed the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having to question whether she belonged anywhere, combined with a calculating intelligence that she used to maintain social dominance through methods sophisticated enough to avoid obvious disciplinary consequences. Madison's inner circle consisted of 3 equally privileged young women who had perfected a system of targeted harassment that they euphemistically called social quality control, but which functioned as a deliberate campaign to drive away students they considered incompatible with Riverside's elite reputation. Chelsea Whitman, whose federal judge father had taught her to find legal loopholes in university policies, served as the group's strategic planner, crafting harassment campaigns that remained technically within institutional boundaries while being psychologically devastating to their targets. Brooke Hamilton, whose tech executive mother had given her early access to social media platforms and digital marketing tools, managed the technological aspects of their operations, creating fake accounts and coordinating online attacks that left no clear evidence trail. Taylor Brooks, whose family's construction company had built half the buildings in downtown Riverside, handled the physical intimidation aspects of their campaigns, using her imposing presence and athletic background to create atmospheres of menace without crossing legal lines that might trigger serious consequences. Together, the 4 women had refined their methods over 2 years of practice, successfully forcing 8 students to transfer or drop out through psychological pressure campaigns that administrators consistently failed to investigate effectively. They called themselves the Elite Four in private communications, a name that reflected both their social status and their view of themselves as guardians of institutional standards that lesser students threatened simply by existing. Emma first appeared on their radar during her second week at Riverside, when she had been sitting alone in the campus coffee shop studying emergency medical procedures while eating a sandwich she had packed in her dorm room. Madison and her crew occupied their usual table near the front windows, a location that allowed them to observe and comment on other students while projecting an image of casual superiority that intimidated most underclassmen. Taylor had noticed Emma first, pointing out her worn backpack and the fact that she was eating homemade food instead of purchasing items from the expensive campus dining options that most students took for granted. Transfer student Chelsea had whispered to Madison, though Emma was actually a freshman whose local background made her seem like an outsider despite having grown up nearby. Scholarship case. Definitely doesn't understand what this place is about. Madison had studied Emma with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to identify threats to her social position before they became problematic, seeing in the quiet young woman exactly the type of student who might succeed academically despite lacking the proper social credentials that Madison believed should determine access to prestigious opportunities. What Madison couldn't see, what none of them could recognize, was the controlled alertness in Emma's posture as she studied. The way her eyes occasionally swept the coffee shop with tactical awareness learned in a boxing gym, where spatial recognition could mean the difference between landing a punch and walking into one. Emma's apparent vulnerability masked years of training that had taught her to assess potential threats while maintaining the appearance of casual indifference, skills that were invisible to people who had never faced real danger or learned to defend themselves against anything more serious than social embarrassment. The initial campaign against Emma began with the subtle psychological tactics that the Elite Four had perfected through previous operations. Brooke created fake social media accounts to send Emma anonymous messages questioning her admission to Riverside and suggesting that her scholarship had displaced more deserving students whose families had supported the university for generations. Chelsea used her access to student government records to discover details about Emma's financial aid package, then spread carefully crafted rumors about, quote, "coot" charity cases who were lowering academic standards and changing the character of campus culture. Taylor began appearing at locations where Emma studied regularly, not approaching directly but creating an atmosphere of vague intimidation through her presence, and occasional pointed comments about students who didn't seem to fit Riverside's traditional profile. Madison coordinated these efforts while maintaining plausible deniability, positioning herself as someone who was simply concerned about maintaining institutional excellence rather than targeting individual students for personal reasons. But Emma had encountered bullies before, both in high school and in the boxing gym, where trash talk and psychological intimidation were recognized as legitimate tactical approaches that fighters needed to learn to handle. Her response strategy reflected lessons learned both from Coach Santos and from her father's approach to dealing with people who used fear as a weapon. Document everything, stay focused on long-term goals, and never allow other people's insecurity to distract from personal mission. She screenshotted the anonymous messages, noted the timing and location of Taylor's intimidating appearances, and kept detailed records of every incident while continuing to maintain her perfect academic performance. What Emma didn't anticipate was the particular persistence of Madison's group or the extent of their protection within university systems that were supposed to maintain fair treatment for all students. When she reported the anonymous messages to campus security, the officer who took her statement was Taylor's fraternity boyfriend, who filed the complaint but failed to investigate seriously. When she tried to discuss the harassment with her academic advisor, she discovered that Chelsea's mother served on the committee that reviewed scholarship renewals, creating a conflict of interest that made professional advocacy dangerous for faculty members who valued their job security. The harassment escalated throughout Emma's first semester as Madison's group recognized that their standard tactics weren't producing the desired results. Emma's bike tires were slashed twice in 1 month, forcing her to walk to her part-time job at the campus bookstore and frequently arriving late, despite leaving early to compensate for the longer commute. Her laptop disappeared from her locked dorm room during Thanksgiving break, reappearing 3 days later in a campus bathroom with several important files corrupted and assignments that she had to recreate from scratch, causing her to miss deadlines and receive reduced grades on projects that represented weeks of work. Someone had signed Emma up for dozens of unwanted mailing lists and subscription services, flooding her email with spam that made it difficult to identify important academic communications from professors and administrators. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her campus dining account was mysteriously drained twice, forcing her to survive on the emergency food supplies she kept in her dorm room, while waiting for the charges to be investigated and reversed by university bureaucrats who seemed more interested in avoiding responsibility than solving problems. Each incident was carefully designed to disrupt Emma's studies and create constant stress, without leaving clear evidence of intentional sabotage, a pattern of harassment that the Elite Four had perfected through practice on previous victims, who had eventually transferred rather than continue fighting a war of attrition they couldn't win. Madison's group was confident that Emma would become their 9th successful expulsion, underestimating both her resilience and the strategic thinking skills that boxing had taught her about analyzing opponents and planning long-term tactical responses. Instead of cracking under pressure, Emma began adapting her defensive strategies while continuing to excel academically, despite the constant disruptions to her routine. She installed a security camera in her dorm room, started varying her daily schedule to avoid predictable patterns, and began networking with other students who had experienced similar harassment but had been afraid to report it formally due to fear of retaliation. Through these conversations, Emma discovered that the Elite Four's campaign against her was part of a larger pattern of systematic abuse that had been ongoing for years, protected by family connections and administrative indifference that prioritized donor relationships over student safety. This network of targeted students provided Emma with emotional support and tactical intelligence about her opponent's methods. But it also revealed the full scope of the institutional protection that made Madison's group so confident in their impunity. Previous victims had tried reporting harassment through official channels, only to discover that complaint procedures were designed more to protect the university from liability than to actually address problems, especially when the perpetrators came from families whose financial contributions were considered essential to institutional operations. Emma learned that the Elite Four followed a predictable escalation pattern with their harassment campaigns, typically moving from anonymous digital attacks to property destruction to psychological intimidation, before culminating in a dramatic public humiliation designed to force their target to leave campus permanently. The final confrontation usually occurred at a significant event where maximum emotional damage could be inflicted in front of witnesses who would remember the victim's breakdown rather than the circumstances that caused it. Understanding this pattern allowed Emma to begin preparing for the inevitable final escalation while continuing to document evidence that might eventually prove useful if legal action became necessary. She started carrying a digital recorder during daily activities, mapped campus locations where previous confrontations had occurred, and began subtly testing her boxing skills during late-night training sessions at O'Brien's gym to ensure that her physical capabilities remained sharp despite months of academic focus. The approaching Memorial Day weekend brought the annual Heritage Garden Memorial Service, a university tradition that honored local residents who had died in military or public service, including Emma's father, whose name had been added to the memorial wall 2 years earlier. Emma had been planning to attend the ceremony since the beginning of the semester, viewing it as an opportunity to honor her father's memory in the academic environment that his sacrifice had made possible for her to access. She had spent weeks saving money to purchase a simple navy blue dress appropriate for the solemn occasion, a garment that represented not only respect for her father's memory, but also her determination to participate fully in university life, despite the ongoing harassment campaign. The dress cost more than Emma typically spent on clothing, requiring her to skip meals and work extra hours at the bookstore, but she viewed the expense as an investment in her sense of belonging and dignity in an environment where appearance often determined how seriously people were taken. Madison's group had been monitoring Emma's preparations for the memorial service, recognizing it as the perfect opportunity for their final devastating attack. The combination of emotional vulnerability, public setting, and personal significance created ideal conditions for the type of humiliation that would force Emma to abandon her academic goals and leave Riverside permanently. They had obtained bright red paint from Taylor's family's construction supplies, planning to drench Emma's memorial dress during the ceremony in a calculated act of cruelty that would destroy both her appearance and her ability to honor her father's memory with the dignity she had worked so hard to achieve. What the Elite Four didn't understand was that their choice of target and timing had pushed Emma past the point where tactical restraint remained her primary strategy. 6 years of boxing training had taught her not only how to absorb punishment, but how to recognize when defensive measures were no longer sufficient and offensive action became necessary for survival. Coach Santos had always emphasized that the most dangerous moment in any fight came when a patient opponent finally decided that enough was enough and began using their full capabilities instead of holding back. Emma's quiet demeanor and academic focus had concealed months of strategic preparation and emotional conditioning that would soon be tested in ways that her opponents couldn't anticipate or understand. The memorial service that Madison's group viewed as the perfect opportunity for humiliation was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would expose the difference between inherited privilege and earned strength, between bullying tactics and genuine fighting ability, between those who used cruelty to maintain power and those who used discipline to protect what mattered most. The navy blue dress hanging in Emma's closet represented more than just appropriate attire for a memorial service. It symbolized her determination to honor her father's legacy with dignity, her refusal to be driven away from opportunities he had died to provide, and her belief that respect was something that should be earned through character rather than purchased through family wealth. Madison Pierce and her crew were about to discover that some things were worth fighting for, and some people had spent years learning exactly how to fight when fighting became necessary. Emma's boxing education had begun in the cramped basement of O'Brien's Community Center, where peeling paint on concrete walls bore witness to decades of young people learning to transform pain into purpose. Coach Mike Santos had recognized something familiar in the 13-year-old girl who appeared at his gym 3 months after reading about her father's heroic death in the local newspaper. The way she held herself, shoulders squared despite the weight of grief, reminded him of his own daughter who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier, leaving him with an understanding of how loss could either destroy someone or forge them into something stronger than they ever imagined possible. The first lesson Coach Santos taught Emma had nothing to do with punches or defensive stances. Instead, he spent 3 weeks having her sweep floors, organize equipment, and observe other fighters without ever putting on gloves herself. This period of forced patience taught Emma that boxing was fundamentally about discipline and respect, rather than aggression and dominance, values that would serve her far beyond any athletic competition she might eventually enter. She learned to arrive early and stay late, to treat the gym as sacred space where effort mattered more than natural talent, and to understand that real strength came from the willingness to be vulnerable enough to learn from people who knew more than she did. When Emma finally began training, Coach Santos focused entirely on fundamentals that seemed boring compared to the flashy combinations she saw other fighters practicing. Months of footwork drills taught her how to move efficiently while maintaining balance under pressure. Countless hours hitting heavy bags developed muscle memory that would allow her to throw accurate punches even when exhausted or emotionally overwhelmed. Defensive exercises using tennis balls thrown at unpredictable angles improved her reflexes while teaching her to remain calm when multiple threats approached simultaneously. Every technique was practiced thousands of times until it became as automatic as breathing, creating a foundation of physical competence that could support more advanced skills later. The mental conditioning proved even more demanding than the physical training. Coach Santos required Emma to maintain perfect academic performance as a condition of continuing to train, explaining that boxing without education was just violence, while education without the confidence to defend oneself left people vulnerable to those who would exploit perceived weakness. He taught her visualization techniques that allowed her to mentally rehearse responses to various scenarios, from competitive matches to street confrontations, to social situations where physical fighting wasn't appropriate, but mental toughness remained essential. Most importantly, he instilled the principle that fighting skills should never be used unless absolutely necessary for protection of self or others, but that when such situations arose, hesitation could be deadly. By 16, Emma was competing in regional amateur tournaments against opponents who had been boxing since elementary school, consistently winning matches through superior conditioning and tactical intelligence rather than raw power or natural athleticism. Her style emphasized patience and precision over aggression, wearing down opponents through accumulated damage while avoiding the dramatic knockout attempts that left fighters vulnerable to counterattacks. Judges and spectators often underestimated her during the opening rounds, only to realize in later stages that her seemingly defensive approach had been systematically dismantling her opponent's effectiveness while preserving her own energy for decisive moments. The boxing community became Emma's second family, providing mentorship and support that helped her navigate adolescence without the guidance of her deceased father. Veteran fighters shared stories about their own struggles with loss, addiction, and poverty, teaching Emma that everyone carried invisible battles, and that true courage meant continuing to fight even when victory seemed impossible. She learned that respect in the boxing world was earned through consistency and character rather than individual achievements, and that the strongest fighters were often those who used their skills to protect others rather than to prove their own dominance. Coach Santos eventually revealed that he had been quietly documenting Emma's development, not just as a fighter but as a person, keeping detailed records of her academic progress, community service, and the way she treated less experienced fighters who sought her guidance. These records became part of scholarship applications that helped secure Emma's admission to Riverside State University, though she never learned the full extent of his advocacy on her behalf until years later. His final piece of advice before she left for college was that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared harmless until circumstances forced them to reveal their true capabilities. Emma's decision to keep her boxing background secret at university stemmed from strategic considerations rather than shame about her blue-collar training. She had observed during campus visits that students and faculty often held unconscious biases about combat sports, viewing them as primitive or inappropriate for academic environments where intellectual achievement was supposed to matter more than physical prowess. More importantly, she understood that being underestimated could provide tactical advantages in social situations where conflict was inevitable, but direct confrontation wasn't yet justified or strategic. The boxing gym had taught Emma to read people's intentions through body language, vocal patterns, and the subtle signals that preceded aggressive behavior, skills that proved invaluable in navigating university social dynamics even when she never mentioned their source. She could identify potential threats before they became obvious, assess group dynamics to understand who held real power versus who merely appeared influential, and recognize when someone was testing her boundaries to determine how much abuse she would tolerate before fighting back. These insights allowed her to prepare defensive strategies while maintaining the appearance of naive vulnerability that often made aggressors overconfident and careless. Emma's daily routine at Riverside included early morning runs that maintained her cardiovascular conditioning, bodyweight exercises in her dorm room that preserved her strength training, and occasional late-night visits to O'Brien's gym when academic stress required the kind of physical release that only hitting heavy bags could provide. She told her roommate Sarah that these activities were for stress management and general fitness, explanations that were technically true while concealing the specific skills that 6 years of disciplined training had developed. The deception felt uncomfortable, but Emma understood that survival in hostile environments sometimes required allowing others to maintain comfortable illusions about your capabilities. Meanwhile, Madison Pierce occupied the apex of Riverside State University's social hierarchy through a combination of inherited privilege and carefully cultivated influence that made her simultaneously envied and feared by students who understood how effortlessly she could enhance or destroy their campus experience. Her family's real estate empire controlled significant commercial and residential properties throughout the region, including several apartment buildings where university faculty lived and retail spaces where students worked part-time jobs. This economic leverage created subtle but powerful dependencies that extended Madison's influence far beyond the campus boundaries, making opposition to her wishes potentially costly in ways that victims often didn't recognize until after they had been targeted. Madison's approach to social dominance reflected sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that she had absorbed through childhood exposure to her parents' business and political activities. Rather than relying on crude intimidation or obvious displays of wealth, she preferred psychological manipulation that left victims questioning their own perceptions while being unable to identify specific actions that justified complaints to authority figures. Her methods included strategic distribution of invitations to exclusive events that established social hierarchies, careful management of rumors and gossip that could enhance or destroy reputations, and the use of institutional connections to influence academic and disciplinary decisions in ways that appeared coincidental rather than deliberately vindictive. The Elite Four had perfected their harassment system through 2 years of practice on students they considered incompatible with Riverside's elite reputation, refining techniques until they could drive away targets without creating evidence that would support formal complaints or legal action. Their selection criteria focused on students who represented challenges to the social order they believed themselves responsible for maintaining. Scholarship recipients whose academic success might overshadow legacy students, working-class locals whose presence reminded wealthy families of the economic realities they preferred to ignore, and anyone whose values or background suggested they might question the privileges that Madison's group considered natural and deserved. Chelsea Whitman served as the group's strategic planner, using knowledge gained from her federal judge father to understand legal boundaries that harassment campaigns needed to respect while remaining psychologically devastating to their targets. Her pre-law studies provided technical vocabulary that made their activities sound like legitimate quality control rather than systematic bullying, while her family connections offered protection against disciplinary consequences even when their actions approached illegal territory. Chelsea's role involved researching potential targets through social media analysis, academic records review, and financial aid status investigation, creating comprehensive profiles that identified psychological vulnerabilities and tactical opportunities for maximum impact with minimum legal risk. Brooke Hamilton managed the technological aspects of their operations with expertise developed through early access to social media platforms and digital marketing tools provided by her tech executive mother's company. Her responsibilities included creating fake accounts that appeared authentic enough to avoid detection by university IT security, coordinating online harassment campaigns that maintained plausible deniability for the actual perpetrators, and documenting target responses through screenshots and recordings that could be used either for blackmail or to demonstrate victim instability if formal complaints were filed. Brooke's technical skills allowed the group to operate across multiple digital platforms simultaneously, while maintaining anonymity that made investigation by campus authorities nearly impossible. Taylor Brooks handled the physical intimidation components of their campaigns, using her imposing presence and athletic background to create atmospheres of menace without crossing legal boundaries that might trigger serious consequences from law enforcement or university disciplinary systems. Her family's construction business had taught her to understand spatial dynamics and crowd psychology, knowledge she applied to positioning herself in ways that made targets feel threatened while maintaining plausible claims of coincidental presence if questioned by authorities. Taylor's role also included recruiting sympathetic students who could serve as witnesses to support false narratives about target behavior, creating networks of coordinated testimony that made victim complaints appear unreliable or vindictive. The Elite Four's previous successes had established a pattern of escalating harassment that typically concluded with dramatic public humiliation, designed to force targets into voluntary withdrawal from the university, rather than formal expulsion that might create uncomfortable questions about institutional failure to protect students. Their most effective campaigns combined digital harassment with property destruction, social isolation with academic sabotage, and psychological pressure with physical intimidation, creating comprehensive attacks on every aspect of target's campus experience until remaining at Riverside became emotionally and practically impossible. Madison's personal investment in targeting Emma reflected deeper insecurities about merit-based achievement that threatened her worldview about natural hierarchies and inherited privilege. Emma's combination of academic excellence, dignified behavior, and obvious financial sacrifice to attend Riverside represented everything that Madison feared about changing social dynamics that might eventually value character and competence over family connections and economic status. The fact that Emma seemed genuinely unimpressed by wealth and social position made her particularly threatening to someone whose entire identity depended on others recognizing and respecting her presumed superiority. The selection of Emma as their next target had been unanimous among the Elite Four, though each member was motivated by slightly different concerns about what she represented. Chelsea viewed Emma's scholarship status as evidence of reverse discrimination that gave undeserved advantages to students who hadn't earned access to elite institutions through family legacy and financial contribution. Brooke saw Emma's indifference to social media and designer fashion as an implicit criticism of values that Brooke considered essential to university social life. Taylor interpreted Emma's quiet confidence as arrogance that needed to be corrected through the kind of harsh lessons that would teach proper deference to established hierarchies. Their initial research into Emma's background had revealed surface details about her father's death and her family's financial circumstances, but had missed entirely the boxing training that represented the most significant aspect of her preparation for exactly the kind of confrontation they were planning to create. The Elite Four's confidence in their ability to destroy Emma's campus experience reflected their success against previous targets who had lacked both the psychological resilience and physical capabilities necessary to resist sustained harassment campaigns. They had never encountered someone who had spent years learning to absorb punishment while planning strategic responses, or someone whose apparent vulnerability concealed genuine fighting skills that could be deployed when defensive measures proved insufficient. Emma's awareness of being targeted had developed gradually through pattern recognition rather than dramatic revelation, as the Elite Four's initial approaches were subtle enough to appear coincidental to someone who hadn't learned to identify predatory behavior through boxing gym experience. The anonymous social media messages, property damage, and social exclusion tactics were sophisticated enough to create plausible deniability, while being obvious enough to achieve their intended psychological impact on someone who hadn't been trained to recognize and counter intimidation strategies. However, Emma's boxing background had taught her to observe opponents carefully before they revealed their full capabilities, knowledge that allowed her to understand the scope of the campaign against her while maintaining the appearance of naive confusion that encouraged her harassers to become overconfident and careless. She recognized the coordinated nature of seemingly separate incidents, identified the escalation pattern that indicated more serious confrontation was inevitable, and began preparing responses that would be legally justified when the situation eventually required them. The Elite Four's confidence in their ultimate success reflected fundamental misunderstanding of what they were actually facing in Emma Rodriguez. They saw a working-class scholarship student whose apparent isolation and financial vulnerability made her an ideal target for the psychological warfare tactics that had proven effective against previous victims. What they failed to recognize was that Emma's quiet demeanor concealed years of preparation for exactly the kind of systematic harassment they specialized in delivering, and that her apparent weakness masked physical and mental capabilities that would soon be tested in ways none of them anticipated or understood. Their decision to target the Memorial Day ceremony represented the culmination of months of planning designed to inflict maximum psychological damage at Emma's most vulnerable moment, when grief for her father and pride in her achievements would be simultaneously at their peak. The choice of bright red paint as their weapon was calculated to create permanent visual evidence of humiliation that would follow Emma throughout her remaining time at Riverside, assuming she chose to stay rather than transfer to escape the constant reminder of her public degradation. Madison's group believed they had identified the perfect opportunity to break Emma's spirit completely, while demonstrating to other potential targets the consequences of challenging established social hierarchies. Their plan involved cornering Emma after the memorial service when she would be emotionally vulnerable and physically isolated, creating conditions where resistance would be impossible and witness testimony could be controlled to support whatever narrative best served their interests. They had no way of knowing that their choice of timing and location would trigger responses from someone who had been preparing for this moment since the day her father died, teaching her that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost involved. The harassment campaign against Emma intensified with methodical precision as winter semester progressed, each incident carefully calibrated to disrupt her academic routine while maintaining enough ambiguity to prevent effective institutional response. Madison's group had perfected their timing to coincide with Emma's most stressful periods, launching new attacks during midterm examinations and major assignment deadlines when her emotional reserves were already depleted by academic pressure. The psychological warfare was designed to create cumulative stress that would eventually overwhelm Emma's ability to maintain the perfect grades required for scholarship renewal, forcing her to choose between academic success and mental health stability. The digital harassment escalated beyond anonymous messages to sophisticated identity theft that threatened Emma's financial security and academic standing simultaneously. Brooke Hamilton used her technical expertise to access Emma's university accounts and alter assignment submissions, just enough to trigger plagiarism detection software, creating academic integrity violations that required time-consuming appeals processes during periods when Emma needed to focus on upcoming examinations. The false positives were eventually resolved in Emma's favor, but not before creating weeks of anxiety about potential scholarship loss and requiring dozens of hours that should have been spent on legitimate coursework. Someone had systematically sabotaged Emma's research projects by corrupting digital files just before major deadlines, forcing her to recreate weeks of work from handwritten notes and backup sources that didn't always contain complete information. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, always occurring during the brief windows when file recovery would be impossible, and extension requests would be viewed skeptically by professors who had heard similar excuses from less dedicated students. Emma found herself working 18-hour days to compensate for lost progress while maintaining the kind of documentation that might eventually prove useful if legal action became necessary. The physical harassment grew more brazen as Emma continued to excel academically despite the ongoing disruption campaign. Her textbooks disappeared from library study areas where she had left them briefly to use restroom facilities, requiring expensive replacements that strained her already tight budget. Personal items vanished from her dorm room during periods when her roommate Sarah was attending classes, reappearing in campus lost-and-found locations days later with subtle damage that made them barely functional but technically intact. The pattern suggested sophisticated surveillance of Emma's schedule combined with access to her living space that should have been impossible without cooperation from university staff or other students. Emma's part-time job at the campus bookstore became another avenue for harassment, as Madison's group used their influence to create customer complaints about Emma's performance that were technically valid but deliberately unfair. Wealthy students would make complex special orders that required Emma to spend hours researching obscure academic texts, then cancel the orders at the last minute in ways that created inventory problems and wasted labor costs that her supervisor couldn't ignore. The complaints were never quite serious enough to justify termination, but they created constant job insecurity that added financial anxiety to the academic and social pressures Emma was already managing. The social isolation tactics proved particularly effective in an environment where networking and relationship building were essential components of academic success. Emma found herself systematically excluded from study groups, research opportunities, and social events that would have enhanced both her educational experience and her post-graduation prospects. Madison's influence extended to student organizations, academic clubs, and even informal gatherings, where Emma's presence was subtly discouraged through venue changes, scheduling conflicts, and social dynamics that made her feel unwelcome without anyone explicitly stating that she wasn't invited. Faculty members who initially showed interest in mentoring Emma gradually became less available, as Madison's family connections created subtle pressure that influenced their willingness to advocate for students whose presence might complicate their own professional relationships. Emma noticed that professors who had encouraged her participation in research projects suddenly had budget constraints or scheduling conflicts that prevented her involvement, while similar opportunities remained available to students whose families had stronger university connections. The academic isolation was particularly devastating because it threatened Emma's long-term career goals in ways that went far beyond immediate graduation requirements. Emma's response to the escalating harassment reflected lessons learned through years of boxing training about maintaining composure under pressure, while systematically analyzing opponent weaknesses that could be exploited when counterattack became necessary. Rather than allowing emotional reactions to dictate her strategy, she approached the situation with the same methodical patience that had made her successful in competitive boxing, where impulsive responses often created opportunities for opponents who were prepared to capitalize on momentary lapses in judgment and defensive positioning. The documentation process became Emma's primary defensive strategy, as she applied investigative techniques that Coach Santos had taught her about studying opponent patterns and identifying predictable behaviors that could be anticipated and countered. She maintained detailed logs of every harassment incident, including timestamps, locations, witness information, and photographic evidence whenever possible. The records revealed patterns of coordination that would be difficult to explain as coincidence if legal proceedings eventually became necessary, while also providing tactical intelligence about her opponent's methods and timing preferences. Emma's academic advisor, Professor Linda Garcia, proved to be one of the few faculty members willing to acknowledge the harassment pattern, though her ability to intervene directly was limited by institutional politics that protected influential families over individual students. Professor Garcia helped Emma document the academic sabotage incidents in ways that created official records of the pattern, while advising her about university policies that might eventually provide recourse if enough evidence could be accumulated. More importantly, she validated Emma's perceptions about the coordinated nature of the attacks, providing emotional support that helped Emma maintain confidence in her own judgment, despite gaslighting tactics designed to make her question whether the harassment was actually occurring. The investigation revealed that Emma wasn't the first student to experience systematic harassment from Madison's group, though previous victims had either transferred voluntarily or been driven away before accumulating enough evidence to support formal complaints. Professor Garcia discreetly connected Emma with 3 former students who had left Riverside under similar circumstances, providing testimony that established a clear pattern of predatory behavior that the university administration had consistently failed to address effectively. These conversations also revealed tactical information about the Elite Four's escalation methods that helped Emma prepare for the inevitable final confrontation. Emma began varying her daily routines to avoid predictable patterns that made surveillance and sabotage easier for her harassers, applying situational awareness techniques that boxing training had taught her about controlling engagement distances and timing. She started studying in different locations each day, changing her routes between classes and dormitory, and coordinating with Sarah to ensure that her room was never left completely unguarded during periods when valuable items or important documents might be vulnerable to theft or destruction. The physical preparation intensified as Emma recognized that the harassment campaign was building towards some form of direct confrontation that would require more than defensive measures to resolve successfully. Her late-night visits to O'Brien's gym became more frequent and intensive, focusing on combination drills and sparring sessions that maintained her technical skills, while building the kind of explosive power that might be necessary if verbal de-escalation proved insufficient. Coach Santos noticed the change in Emma's training intensity and began incorporating scenario-based exercises that prepared her for fighting in confined spaces against multiple opponents. Emma's growing network of harassment victims provided both emotional support and tactical intelligence about the Elite Four's standard operating procedures, revealing that their campaigns typically concluded with public humiliation events designed to create lasting psychological damage that would prevent targets from remaining at Riverside, even if they survived the immediate confrontation. The pattern suggested that Madison's group was planning some form of dramatic finale that would occur during a significant campus event, where maximum emotional impact could be achieved while ensuring adequate witness presence to spread news of Emma's degradation throughout the university community. The revelation that previous harassment campaigns had culminated in public humiliation attempts helped Emma understand that defensive strategies alone would be insufficient to protect herself against opponents who were committed to escalating their attacks until they achieved complete victory or faced serious consequences for their actions. Boxing training had taught her that some fights could only be avoided by demonstrating superior fighting capability that made continued aggression too costly for opponents to maintain, a lesson that seemed increasingly relevant as the Elite Four's confidence grew and their attacks became more brazen. Emma's psychological preparation involved techniques that Coach Santos had taught her about managing pre-fight anxiety while maintaining tactical awareness that would be essential during high-stress confrontations. She practiced visualization exercises that allowed her to mentally rehearse responses to various scenarios, from verbal intimidation to physical assault, ensuring that muscle memory would function effectively even when adrenaline and emotion threatened to overwhelm rational decision-making. The mental conditioning was as important as physical training, because boxing had taught her that fights were often won or lost in the mind before physical contact ever occurred. The approaching Memorial Day weekend brought increased urgency to Emma's preparation, as she realized that the annual Heritage Gardens ceremony would provide exactly the kind of emotionally significant public event that fit the Elite Four's pattern for final confrontations. Emma's plan to honor her father's memory at the ceremony made her particularly vulnerable to psychological attack, while the formal dress code and outdoor setting created conditions where physical humiliation could be inflicted with maximum impact and minimum opportunity for immediate retaliation. Emma's decision to purchase the navy blue memorial dress represented more than just appropriate attire for the ceremony. It symbolized her determination to participate fully in university life, despite ongoing harassment and her refusal to allow others' cruelty to diminish her respect for her father's sacrifice. The financial sacrifice required to afford the dress made it even more meaningful, representing weeks of skipped meals and extra work hours that demonstrated her commitment to honoring her father's memory with dignity, regardless of personal cost. The dress shopping experience itself revealed the extent of Madison's surveillance network, as Emma noticed subtle following during her trip to downtown Riverside's only formal wear store that catered to students with limited budgets. The knowledge that even her most private preparations were being monitored added another layer of violation to the harassment campaign while confirming Emma's suspicions that the upcoming memorial service would become the setting for whatever final attack the Elite Four was planning. Emma's strategic thinking during this period reflected boxing lessons about controlling fight timing and location to maximize personal advantages while minimizing opponents' strengths. She understood that Madison's group was trying to force a confrontation during the memorial service, when Emma would be emotionally vulnerable and surrounded by formal ceremony constraints that would limit her response options. However, Emma also recognized that the same conditions might provide opportunities to turn the Elite Four's tactics against them if she could maintain emotional control while preparing for rapid tactical adjustment when circumstances required it. The week before Memorial Day brought subtle changes in the Elite Four's behavior that Emma's trained observation skills identified as indicators of impending escalation. Madison seemed more confident during their occasional campus encounters, displaying the kind of predatory satisfaction that boxers showed when they believed they had identified a decisive opening in their opponent's defenses. Chelsea's attempts at casual conversation with mutual acquaintances included pointed questions about Emma's memorial service plans that suggested intelligence gathering for operational purposes rather than genuine social interest. Brooke's social media activity showed increased coordination with accounts that Emma had identified as likely fake profiles created for harassment purposes, suggesting that digital documentation of whatever confrontation was being planned would be a priority for creating lasting humiliation that extended beyond the immediate incident. Taylor's physical positioning during campus encounters became more aggressive and testing, creating minor confrontations that seemed designed to assess Emma's likely responses to more serious provocation. Emma's recognition of these behavioral changes reflected years of training in reading opponent tells and recognizing escalation patterns that preceded major tactical shifts in competitive boxing matches. The Elite Four's growing confidence and obvious preparation suggested that they were approaching what they believed would be their decisive victory over someone they continued to view as helpless victim rather than potentially dangerous opponent. Their overconfidence was becoming their primary vulnerability, creating opportunities that Emma was quietly preparing to exploit when the inevitable confrontation finally occurred. The Memorial Day weekend arrived with Emma as prepared as 6 years of boxing training and months of strategic planning could make her for whatever challenge the Elite Four was about to present. Her navy blue dress hung in her dormitory closet like battle armor, representing both her determination to honor her father's memory with dignity and her refusal to be driven away from opportunities that his sacrifice had made possible. The memorial service would test everything that Coach Santos had taught her about courage, discipline, and the sometimes necessary application of force in defense of values that were worth fighting to protect. Emma understood that the upcoming confrontation would likely determine not just her own future at Riverside State University, but potentially the safety and security of every student who might become a target of systematic harassment if the Elite Four's campaign against her succeeded. The responsibility was enormous, but her training had prepared her for exactly this kind of pressure, where individual courage could create changes that protected others who lacked the capabilities to protect themselves. The quiet scholarship student was about to discover whether 6 years of disciplined preparation would prove sufficient when everything she valued was finally put to the ultimate test. The Memorial Day ceremony began with solemn dignity befitting the sacrifice it honored, as families and university officials gathered in Heritage Garden beneath overcast skies that seemed appropriate for remembering those who had given their lives in service to others. Emma arrived 30 minutes early, wearing her navy blue dress with quiet pride and carrying a single white rose that she planned to place at her father's memorial plaque during the moment of silence. The formal ceremony provided exactly the kind of meaningful closure she had hoped for when planning to attend, allowing her to honor Captain Miguel Rodriguez's memory in the academic environment that his sacrifice had made possible for her to access. The garden setting created an atmosphere of respectful reverence, with carefully maintained landscaping surrounding granite monuments that bore the names of local residents who had died while serving their community through military service, law enforcement, and emergency response. Emma's father's name had been added to the firefighter memorial 2 years earlier, etched in stone that would preserve his legacy long after everyone who knew him personally had passed away. Standing before the memorial wall, Emma felt the weight of responsibility that came with being his daughter, and the recipient of opportunities that existed because he had chosen duty over personal safety when circumstances demanded ultimate sacrifice. The ceremony proceeded according to schedule, with university officials delivering prepared remarks about service, sacrifice, and the debt that survivors owed to those who had died protecting others. Emma listened respectfully while scanning the crowd for signs of the Elite Four, whose absence seemed conspicuous given their usual presence at campus events where social networking opportunities existed. The lack of visible threat created a false sense of security that Emma's boxing training warned her not to trust, as experienced fighters understood that opponents often appeared most dangerous when they seemed to have disappeared entirely. As the formal ceremony concluded and attendees began dispersing toward their vehicles, Emma approached her father's memorial plaque for the private moment she had been anticipating throughout the semester. The simple inscription read, "Captain Miguel Rodriguez, Fire Department, died in service to community," words that captured only the most basic facts about a man whose courage and dedication had shaped every aspect of Emma's character development. She placed the white rose beneath his name and stood silently for several minutes, drawing strength from the connection to someone who had taught her through example that some values were worth defending, regardless of personal cost. The attack came without warning as Emma turned to leave the memorial garden, walking toward the parking structure where she had left her bicycle after the formal ceremony concluded. Madison Pierce and her 3 companions emerged from behind utility buildings, where they had been waiting with calculated patience, their timing designed to catch Emma in the vulnerable transition period between public ceremony and private departure, when witnesses would be minimal and emotional defenses would be lowest due to grief and reflection about her father's death. Madison carried a large plastic bottle filled with bright red paint that appeared almost blood-like in the dim lighting of the parking structure, while Chelsea held a second container and Brooke positioned herself to record the attack with professional quality video equipment that suggested extensive planning for creating lasting documentation of Emma's humiliation. Taylor blocked the most direct exit route, using her imposing physical presence to create the kind of confined space that would prevent escape, while ensuring that Emma would be forced to endure whatever degradation they had planned as their final victory celebration. "Well, well," Madison said, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed they were about to achieve decisive victory over an opponent who had proven surprisingly resistant to previous harassment attempts. "Look what we have here. The scholarship princess, all dressed up for her little memorial service." She gestured toward Emma's navy blue dress with mock sympathy that couldn't disguise the predatory satisfaction in her expression. Such a touching tribute to Daddy's memory. Too bad it's about to get much more colorful. Chelsea stepped forward with her container of paint, adding her own contribution to the psychological intimidation that preceded their planned physical assault. "We've been thinking about your situation, Emma, and we've decided that you need a more visual reminder of where you actually belong in this university's social structure. Consider this a learning experience about respecting your betters and understanding boundaries that you should never have tried to cross." Taylor moved closer, using her athletic build to create additional physical intimidation while maintaining the group's coordinated positioning that prevented Emma from reaching any exit without passing through at least one opponent who was prepared to block her escape attempt. "Nothing personal, Rodriguez. You just picked the wrong school to play your little scholarship girl act. Time for a reality check about what happens when people like you forget their place." Brooke continued recording while providing her own commentary for whatever social media distribution they planned to arrange after completing their attack. "This is what happens when charity cases think they can compete with students who actually belong at prestigious institutions. Maybe next time you'll choose a community college more suited to your background and abilities." The paint attack began, with Madison stepping forward and raising her container toward Emma's dress, clearly intending to drench the memorial attire that represented not only appropriate ceremony respect, but also significant financial sacrifice that had required weeks of careful budgeting to afford. The symbolic destruction was calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage by ruining both Emma's appearance and her ability to honor her father's memory with the dignity that she had worked so hard to achieve through months of preparation and anticipation. Emma's response came with the fluid precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment since her first day at Riverside State University. As Madison began to throw the paint, Emma shifted her weight and stepped slightly to her left, causing the liquid to miss its intended target, while simultaneously closing the distance between herself and her primary attacker, with movements that were too fast and coordinated to represent lucky accident or fortunate reflex action. The revelation of Emma's true capabilities began with a perfectly executed combination that Coach Santos had taught her specifically for close-quarters confrontations against larger opponents who relied on intimidation rather than actual fighting skills. Her first punch, a precise jab to Madison's solar plexus, delivered exactly enough force to double her over-gasping, while avoiding injury serious enough to create legal complications that might undermine Emma's self-defense justification for responding with physical force against what had clearly become an assault. Chelsea's attempt to join the attack by throwing her own container of paint provided Emma with legal justification for expanding her defensive response to include multiple attackers who were acting in coordination to inflict harm that went beyond mere harassment into criminal assault territory. Emma's second combination, a controlled hook followed by an uppercut that demonstrated technical precision rather than uncontrolled rage, sent Chelsea stumbling backward into Brooke and disrupting both their physical positioning and their ability to continue recording the encounter that was supposed to showcase Emma's humiliation rather than their own defeat. Taylor's decision to physically grab Emma's arm represented the tactical mistake that transformed a manageable situation into a complete disaster for the Elite Four. Emma's response to being seized demonstrated why Coach Santos had spent years teaching her to remain calm under pressure, while applying only the minimum force necessary to neutralize threats effectively. The arm drag and hip toss that sent Taylor crashing to the concrete parking structure floor showcased technical skill that could only have been developed through years of dedicated training under expert supervision. 6 years of boxing training, Emma said quietly, settling into a formal fighting stance that revealed the complete transformation from apparent victim to obvious predator that her opponents had never imagined was possible. Golden Gloves regional champion 2 years running. O'Brien's Gym, where they teach you to fight for the right reasons and use exactly the force necessary to protect what matters most. The revelation hit the Elite Four with devastating psychological impact that was almost as significant as the physical demonstration of Emma's capabilities. Everything they thought they knew about power dynamics, victim selection, and their own invulnerability had been proven completely wrong in less than 60 seconds of actual confrontation. Madison struggled to breathe normally while comprehending that her confidence in Emma's helplessness had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of what they were actually facing in someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of systematic harassment and inevitable physical confrontation. Chelsea and Brooke attempted to retreat toward the stairwell exit, but Emma's positioning and movement demonstrated tactical awareness that prevented their escape while maintaining legal justification for her continued defensive actions. "This isn't over," Chelsea managed to say, though her voice carried none of the authority and threat that had characterized their previous interactions with students who lacked the capabilities to resist their harassment campaigns effectively. "Actually, it is over," Emma replied, her tone carrying the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the power dynamic had shifted permanently and irrevocably in her favor. "You attacked me during a memorial service honoring my father's sacrifice, using paint that could have caused permanent damage to my dress and created lasting humiliation, designed to drive me away from opportunities I've earned through academic achievement and personal sacrifice. That was assault, battery, and criminal harassment." Taylor attempted to stand up from the concrete floor, her expression reflecting the kind of shocked disbelief that comes from discovering that someone you believed was helpless actually possessed superior fighting capabilities that had been deliberately concealed until circumstances made their revelation necessary for self-protection. "You can't just attack people like that. We weren't actually going to hurt you. This was supposed to be just a harmless prank between students." Emma's response demonstrated the strategic thinking that boxing training had taught her about controlling post-fight narratives and ensuring that legal consequences would fall on the appropriate parties, regardless of family connections or institutional protection that her opponents might believe would shield them from accountability. "Harmless prank? You coordinated a planned assault using paint that could have caused chemical burns, ambushed me in an isolated location, blocked my exits, and attempted to destroy clothing that represents significant financial sacrifice and emotional meaning related to honoring my deceased father's memory." Madison finally managed to stand upright, though her breathing remained labored and her previous confidence had been completely replaced by the kind of fear that comes from realizing that someone you had systematically underestimated possessed both the capability and legal justification to inflict serious consequences for months of harassment and intimidation. "Listen, Rodriguez, there's been a misunderstanding here. We came down to talk to you about fitting in better at Riverside, and you attacked us unprovoked. When campus security reviews the video footage, they'll see that you initiated violence against 4 students who were just trying to have a conversation." Emma gestured toward the paint containers and the obvious evidence of premeditation that surrounded them in the parking structure, her tone remaining calm despite the adrenaline and emotional intensity of the confrontation that had just concluded in her complete victory. "Interesting theory. Let's examine the evidence and see how your story holds up under investigation. You brought paint containers to a memorial service, waited in hiding until I was isolated, surrounded me to prevent escape, and began throwing chemicals at my formal attire while recording the assault for later distribution. That's not a conversation. That's a coordinated criminal attack." Brooke attempted to delete the video recordings that had captured the entire confrontation, but Emma's tactical awareness had included consideration of digital evidence that might prove crucial for supporting her version of events against whatever false narrative the Elite Four might attempt to construct. "I wouldn't delete that footage if I were you. Campus security cameras have been recording this entire encounter from multiple angles, and tampering with evidence will only create additional criminal charges that your family lawyers will have difficulty explaining away." The threat of security camera footage was partially bluff and partially tactical misdirection, as Emma wasn't entirely certain about camera coverage in this particular section of the parking structure, but her confident delivery made it impossible for her opponents to determine whether challenging her claim would be safe or potentially catastrophic for their legal position. The psychological impact was exactly what Emma intended, as uncertainty about evidence often proved more effective than actual proof when dealing with opponents who were accustomed to operating with impunity. Chelsea attempted to regain some semblance of control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond their ability to manage or manipulate according to their usual methods. "You're making a serious mistake here, Emma. My family has connections throughout this university and the local legal system. If you think filing complaints against students from established families will end well for someone in your position, you're about to learn some very expensive lessons about how power really works in institutions like this." Emma's response reflected not only her tactical preparation for this exact type of threat, but also her understanding of how documentation and evidence could neutralize family connections when criminal behavior was sufficiently well documented and publicly exposed. "Your family connections are interesting, Chelsea, but they become less protective when there's video evidence of coordinated assault, witness testimony from other students you've harassed using identical methods, and a clear pattern of criminal behavior that reflects poorly on institutional integrity." The mention of other victims and documented patterns revealed that Emma's preparation had extended far beyond individual self-defense to include comprehensive case-building that could support legal action against the Elite Four's entire harassment operation. Madison's expression showed dawning recognition that their months of systematic attacks had been recorded and analyzed by someone who understood how to build criminal cases that would withstand legal challenge, even from families with significant resources and institutional influence. Taylor made one final attempt to salvage their position through intimidation tactics that had proven effective against previous targets who lacked both fighting capabilities and strategic preparation. "You're gonna regret this, Rodriguez. You think winning one fight makes you safe? We have friends throughout this campus and the surrounding community. Making enemies of people like us is going to cost you more than you can afford." Emma's final response demonstrated the complete reversal of power dynamics that had occurred through her revelation of capabilities that the Elite Four had never suspected existed beneath her quiet exterior. "Actually, Taylor, I think you're the ones who need to worry about costs. Assault charges, harassment violations, conspiracy to commit crimes, and violation of university codes of conduct will create consequences that even your family money can't easily resolve. And if I hear about any retaliation against me or any other student on this campus, those charges will be the least of your problems." The Elite Four's retreat from the parking structure represented unconditional surrender by opponents who had finally encountered someone prepared to defend themselves effectively against systematic harassment and intimidation. Their confidence in their own invulnerability had been shattered by someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of confrontation, and their previous success against helpless victims had provided no preparation for facing an opponent who possessed superior fighting skills combined with strategic intelligence about building legal cases that could survive family influence and institutional corruption. Emma remained in the parking structure for several minutes after her opponents fled, using breathing techniques that Coach Santos had taught her for managing post-fight adrenaline, while ensuring that her emotional state remained stable enough for rational decision-making about next steps. The confrontation had ended exactly as her training had prepared her to expect, quickly, decisively, and with overwhelming superiority that left no doubt about who possessed actual power when push came to literal shove. The following weeks brought dramatic changes throughout Riverside State University, as word of the parking structure confrontation spread through campus social networks and created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Emma's demonstration that the Elite Four could be defeated encouraged other harassment victims to come forward with their own stories, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that university administrators could no longer ignore or dismiss as isolated incidents between individual students. Professor Garcia worked with Emma to coordinate testimonies from multiple victims whose experiences revealed patterns of criminal behavior that transcended simple campus discipline issues and required involvement from local law enforcement agencies with jurisdiction over assault, harassment, and conspiracy charges. The documentation that Emma had maintained throughout her own harassment experience provided a template that other victims used to organize their evidence in ways that supported comprehensive legal action against the Elite Four's entire operation. Madison Pierce's family initially attempted to use their institutional influence to minimize consequences for their daughter's participation in criminal assault, but the video evidence and multiple victim testimonies created public relations problems that threatened their business interests and social standing throughout the regional community. The real estate empire that had provided Madison with her sense of invulnerability became a liability when negative publicity about systematic harassment began affecting property values and business relationships that depended on community reputation. Chelsea Whitman discovered that her federal judge father's position actually increased rather than decreased the legal consequences she faced, as judicial ethics required him to recuse himself from any involvement in her case, while ensuring that his daughter's criminal behavior didn't create appearance of corruption that might undermine his own professional standing. The pre-law student who had believed her family connections made her untouchable found herself facing criminal charges that would prevent admission to any accredited law school, regardless of her academic achievements. Brooke Hamilton's tech executive mother made the strategic decision to cooperate fully with university and legal investigations, rather than attempting to protect her daughter from consequences that would ultimately prove more expensive than immediate accountability. The social media harassment campaigns that Brooke had orchestrated were traced through digital forensics that revealed the full scope of the Elite Four's operations while providing evidence for additional criminal charges related to cyberstalking and online harassment. Taylor Brooks faced the most severe immediate consequences, as her physical assault on Emma during the parking structure confrontation was captured clearly on security cameras that university officials had no choice but to provide to law enforcement agencies investigating the incident. Her family's construction business suffered contract cancellations and community boycotts that demonstrated how quickly social tolerance could disappear when criminal behavior became publicly known. Emma's academic performance improved dramatically once the constant harassment pressure was removed, allowing her to focus entirely on the emergency medical services coursework that would prepare her for the career in public service that would honor her father's legacy while serving community needs that extended far beyond individual achievement. Her perfect grade point average was restored through appeals processes that corrected the academic sabotage that the Elite Four had inflicted during their harassment campaign. The boxing skills that had remained hidden throughout Emma's first year at Riverside became a source of pride rather than something to be concealed, as other students sought her guidance for self-defense training that could protect them from harassment and assault that university policies had proven inadequate to prevent. Emma began teaching informal classes at O'Brien's gym that provided practical skills while building community networks among students who had previously felt isolated and vulnerable. Coach Santos expressed quiet satisfaction at seeing his student apply years of training to protect not only herself, but other potential victims who lacked the capabilities to defend themselves against systematic predators. Emma's victory represented validation of his teaching philosophy that fighting skills should be developed for protection of self and others, rather than for domination or intimidation of those who posed no genuine threat to anyone. The memorial dress that the Elite Four had attempted to destroy with red paint became a symbol of resilience and dignity that inspired other students to refuse intimidation from those who believed wealth and family connections justified cruel treatment of people they considered inferior. Emma wore the dress to subsequent formal campus events, each appearance serving as a reminder that harassment campaigns could be defeated by people who possessed sufficient preparation and courage to fight back effectively when fighting became necessary. The Heritage Garden memorial service that had been intended as the setting for Emma's humiliation instead became an annual reminder of the values that her father had died defending and that she had proven willing to fight to protect. Captain Miguel Rodriguez's sacrifice had taught his daughter that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost, a lesson that she carried forward into medical school and eventually into emergency medical service career that honored his memory through continued dedication to protecting others. Emma's story spread throughout the regional university system as an example of how individual courage could create institutional changes that protected entire communities of students from harassment and abuse that administrators had previously been unwilling or unable to address effectively. The documentation method she had developed became standard practice for students facing systematic harassment, while her tactical approach to self-defense provided a model for others who needed to protect themselves from predators who relied on apparent victim helplessness. The transformation of Riverside State University's campus culture demonstrated that systemic change could begin with a single person's refusal to accept injustice silently and their willingness to prepare systematically for confrontations that defensive measures alone couldn't prevent. Emma's 6 years of boxing training had prepared her for more than just physical confrontation. They had taught her the mental discipline to remain calm under pressure, the strategic thinking to build comprehensive cases against her opponents, and the moral confidence to use force when force became necessary to protect what mattered most. The Elite Four's attempt to destroy Emma's dignity during her father's memorial service had instead revealed their own fundamental weakness and cowardice when faced with someone who possessed both the capability and justification to defend herself effectively. Their systematic harassment campaign had been designed to prey on perceived helplessness, but Emma Rodriguez had never been helpless. She had simply been patient, prepared, and waiting for the right moment to demonstrate that underestimating the quiet ones could be the most dangerous mistake that bullies ever made. The legacy of that Memorial Day confrontation continued for years, as subsequent students learned that courage was contagious, that preparation could overcome privilege, and that sometimes the most profound changes began with one person's decision to fight back, when fighting back became the only option that preserved dignity, safety, and the values that made education meaningful rather than simply transactional. The immediate aftermath of the parking garage confrontation created shockwaves throughout Riverside State University that extended far beyond the 4 students who had discovered the hard way that systematic harassment could backfire spectacularly when directed at someone who possessed both the skills and determination to fight back effectively. Emma's decisive victory over the Elite Four became campus legend within hours, as students who had witnessed the group's previous cruelty felt a collective sense of satisfaction that justice had finally been served against bullies who had operated with apparent impunity for far too long. Dean Patricia Morgan found herself facing the most significant crisis of her administrative career, as parents, alumni, and board members demanded explanations for how systematic harassment had been allowed to flourish unchecked until it escalated to criminal assault that reflected poorly on institutional integrity throughout the regional academic community. The documentation that Emma had meticulously maintained throughout her harassment experience provided undeniable evidence of administrative failure that had enabled criminal behavior through willful blindness and preferential treatment for students whose families possessed significant financial influence. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the full scope of the Elite Four's criminal enterprise, as digital forensics experts traced their harassment campaigns back nearly 3 years and identified 17 additional victims who had been driven away from Riverside through identical methods of psychological warfare and social isolation. District Attorney Maria Gonzalez announced that her office would pursue criminal charges including conspiracy, assault, harassment, cyberstalking, and civil rights violations that carried potential prison sentences and permanent criminal records that would affect employment and educational opportunities for the rest of their lives. Madison Pierce's family real estate empire began experiencing immediate financial consequences as commercial tenants and residential clients terminated contracts rather than maintain business relationships with a company whose heiress had been arrested for systematic harassment and assault of scholarship students. The Pierce Memorial Library became a source of embarrassment for university officials who recognized that keeping the family name prominent on campus buildings would create ongoing public relations problems that outweighed any financial benefits from continued donor relationships. Madison herself struggled to comprehend how her apparent position of strength had collapsed so completely and so quickly into criminal liability and social ostracism that made her previous campus influence seem like a distant memory. The psychological impact of discovering that someone she had targeted as a helpless victim actually possessed superior fighting capabilities created lasting trauma that required professional counseling to address, while the legal consequences of her actions destroyed her planned future in business administration and social networking that had once seemed guaranteed through family connections. Chelsea Whitman's federal judge father initially attempted to recuse himself from any involvement in his daughter's case, while privately hoping that his judicial connections might provide some protection against the most severe consequences. But the high-profile nature of the harassment scandal made such intervention impossible, without creating appearance of corruption that would threaten his own career and reputation. Chelsea's dreams of law school and legal career were permanently derailed by criminal convictions that made admission to any accredited program impossible, regardless of her academic achievements or family background. The pre-law student who had used her knowledge of legal loopholes to design harassment campaigns that avoided obvious criminal liability discovered that her sophisticated understanding of legal boundaries had actually made her crimes more serious by demonstrating premeditation and deliberate intent to cause harm while evading accountability. Her strategic planning abilities that had once been assets in organizing effective harassment campaigns became evidence of criminal sophistication that increased rather than decreased her legal jeopardy. Brooke Hamilton's tech executive mother made the calculated decision to cooperate fully with law enforcement investigations while distancing their family business from any association with her daughter's criminal behavior. A strategic choice that protected their corporate interests while eliminating any possibility of family support for legal defense or reputation rehabilitation. Brooke's expertise in digital harassment techniques made her particularly valuable to prosecutors who needed technical evidence to support charges against her co-conspirators, creating incentives for cooperation that further fractured the Elite Four's unity. The social media influence that Brooke had cultivated through years of careful networking and content creation became a liability when her online presence was examined by investigators who discovered extensive evidence of harassment campaigns targeting not only Emma, but numerous other students who had been subjected to coordinated digital attacks designed to isolate them from campus social networks. Her technical skills that had made her valuable to the Elite Four's operations became the primary evidence that supported cyberstalking charges carrying significant prison sentences. Taylor Brooks faced the most immediate and severe consequences due to her role as the group's physical enforcer, as security camera footage provided clear evidence of her assault on Emma that left no room for alternative interpretations or claims of self-defense. Her family's construction business suffered immediate contract cancellations and community boycotts that demonstrated how quickly local tolerance for criminal behavior could evaporate when victims possessed the courage and capability to fight back effectively. The athletic scholarship that had provided Taylor with her sense of physical superiority and intimidation capabilities was revoked by university officials who recognized that maintaining financial support for convicted criminals would create unacceptable public relations problems and potential legal liability for the institution. Her dreams of professional athletics were permanently destroyed by criminal convictions that made her ineligible for competitive sports programs, regardless of her physical abilities or previous achievements. Emma's academic performance underwent dramatic improvement once the constant harassment pressure was removed, allowing her to focus entirely on the emergency medical services coursework that would prepare her for career opportunities in public service that honored her father's legacy, while serving community needs that extended far beyond individual achievement. Her perfect grade point average was restored through appeals processes that corrected the academic sabotage that the Elite Four had inflicted during their systematic campaign of educational disruption and psychological warfare. The transformation of Emma's campus experience from constant vigilance against harassment to normal student life focused on learning and personal development demonstrated how much energy and emotional resources had been diverted from productive activities toward defensive measures that were necessary for psychological survival but destructive to academic achievement and social integration. Her renewed ability to participate fully in campus life revealed the true cost of systematic harassment that extended far beyond immediate emotional damage to encompass lost opportunities and stunted personal growth. Professor Garcia's advocacy for Emma throughout the harassment campaign earned her recognition as a faculty member who prioritized student welfare over institutional politics, leading to her appointment as the university's first Director of Student Advocacy and Harassment Prevention. Her new position provided institutional resources and authority to address systematic abuse that had previously been ignored or minimized by administrators who feared confronting influential families and wealthy donors, whose financial support was considered essential to university operations. The academic support network that developed around Emma's case included professors, counselors, and administrators who recognized that protecting vulnerable students from harassment was not only morally necessary but legally required under federal civil rights statutes that made institutions liable for discrimination and abuse that they failed to address adequately. The policy changes that resulted from Emma's case created comprehensive reporting mechanisms and investigative procedures that prioritized victim safety over perpetrator privacy and institutional reputation. Coach Santos received community recognition for his role in training Emma to defend herself effectively against systematic harassment, as local leaders understood that his emphasis on discipline, respect, and controlled application of force had created outcomes that protected not only Emma but potentially dozens of other students who might have become victims if the Elite Four's operations had continued unchecked. His training philosophy that emphasized fighting for the right reasons rather than fighting for dominance or intimidation was validated by Emma's tactical restraint and legal justification for her defensive actions. The boxing program at O'Brien's gym experienced significant growth as parents throughout the community recognized that their children needed practical self-defense skills that could protect them from harassment and assault that institutional authorities had proven inadequate to prevent or address effectively. Coach Santos expanded his curriculum to include specific training for dealing with multiple attackers, confined space confrontations, and the legal considerations that determined when physical force was justified for self-protection rather than aggression. Emma's transition from victim to advocate began during her recovery period, when other harassment victims sought her guidance for building documentation cases and developing strategic responses to systematic abuse that school administrators had failed to address through official channels. Her methodical approach to evidence gathering and tactical planning became a template that other students used to protect themselves from predatory behavior that relied on victim isolation and apparent helplessness to achieve success. The informal self-defense classes that Emma began teaching at the community center attracted students from multiple universities throughout the region who had experienced similar harassment campaigns and needed practical skills for protecting themselves when institutional protection proved inadequate. Her teaching emphasized the same principles that Coach Santos had instilled in her: discipline, respect, controlled force, and the moral responsibility to protect others who lacked the capabilities to defend themselves effectively. The memorial dress that the Elite Four had attempted to destroy with red paint became a powerful symbol of resilience and dignity that inspired other students to refuse intimidation from those who believed wealth and family connections justified cruel treatment of people they considered socially inferior. Emma's decision to continue wearing the dress to formal campus events served as a visual reminder that harassment campaigns could be defeated by people who possessed sufficient preparation and courage to fight back when fighting became necessary for survival and self-respect. The annual Heritage Garden Memorial Service evolved into a broader celebration of service and sacrifice that honored not only military and emergency response personnel, but also civilians who had demonstrated courage in defending others from systematic abuse and institutional indifference. Emma's father's memorial became a focal point for community discussions about values worth defending and the personal cost that sometimes accompanied standing up for justice when easier alternatives existed. The scholarship fund that had originally provided Emma with access to higher education was expanded to support other students from working-class backgrounds who faced harassment and discrimination based on their economic status, family background, or perceived social position within elite academic environments. The fund's expansion was funded partly through legal settlements that the Elite Four's families paid to avoid more serious criminal consequences and civil liability for their children's systematic harassment campaigns. Emma's graduation from Riverside State University was attended by hundreds of community members who recognized her as a symbol of how individual courage could create institutional changes that protected entire communities from systematic abuse and harassment that had previously been tolerated or ignored by those in positions of authority. Her valedictory address focused on the responsibility that education created to protect others who lacked access to opportunities and resources that could help them defend themselves against predatory behavior. The medical school acceptance that Emma received from multiple prestigious institutions reflected not only her academic achievements but also her demonstrated leadership in creating positive social change that extended far beyond individual success to encompass community protection and advocacy for vulnerable populations. Her personal statement from medical school applications emphasized her commitment to emergency medical services that would honor her father's legacy while serving those who needed protection from both physical and psychological harm. Emma's first year of medical school was marked by continued involvement in harassment prevention advocacy as she worked with student organizations throughout the region to develop training programs and support networks that could identify and counter systematic abuse before it escalated to criminal behavior. Her expertise in documentation techniques and tactical response planning made her valuable to student safety programs that sought to address harassment proactively rather than reactively. The research project that Emma began during her second year of medical school focused on the psychological and physiological effects of systematic harassment on academic performance and mental health outcomes. Using anonymous survey data from harassment victims to document long-term consequences that institutional administrators had previously failed to recognize or address adequately. Her research provided scientific evidence for policy changes that prioritized victim protection over perpetrator privacy and institutional reputation management. Dr. Michael Chen, Emma's medical school mentor, recognized that her unique combination of clinical knowledge, tactical training, and advocacy experience made her ideally suited for emergency medical services that often involved domestic violence, assault, and harassment situations where medical treatment needed to be combined with safety planning and legal advocacy. Her training at O'Brien's gym provided practical skills for recognizing and responding to violence that complemented her medical education in ways that enhanced her effectiveness in protecting vulnerable patients. The medical residency program that Emma eventually entered specialized in emergency medicine, with emphasis on trauma response and victim advocacy, allowing her to combine her medical training with her passion for protecting others from systematic abuse and violence. Her residency supervisors noted that her unusual background in both combat training and harassment prevention made her exceptionally effective in treating patients who had experienced violence, while helping them develop safety plans that could prevent future victimization. Emma's eventual career as an emergency medical physician was marked by continued involvement in community safety programs that taught self-defense skills and harassment prevention strategies to vulnerable populations throughout the region. Her work demonstrated that the lessons learned from her confrontation with the Elite Four could be applied to protect others from systematic abuse and violence that threatened both individual safety and community well-being. The marriage that Emma eventually entered was with a fellow emergency medical physician who shared her commitment to protecting others from violence and systematic abuse that institutions had failed to address adequately. Their partnership combined medical expertise with advocacy skills that created comprehensive approaches to violence prevention and victim support that extended far beyond individual treatment to encompass community education and policy development. The children that Emma raised inherited not only her academic achievements and professional success, but also her understanding that privilege carried responsibility to protect others who lacked access to resources and opportunities that could help them defend themselves against systematic abuse and harassment. Her family's commitment to community service honored Captain Miguel Rodriguez's legacy while extending his values of service and sacrifice to new generations who faced different challenges but required similar courage and determination. The boxing gym that Emma eventually established in her community served multiple generations of young people who needed practical skills for protecting themselves from harassment and violence that institutional authorities had proven inadequate to prevent or address effectively. Her gym's emphasis on discipline, respect, and controlled application of force created outcomes that protected not only individual students but entire communities from systematic abuse and predatory behavior. The university policy changes that resulted from Emma's case became models for institutions throughout the nation that sought to address systematic harassment and discrimination more effectively than traditional administrative procedures had proven capable of achieving. Her documentation methods and tactical response strategies were incorporated into training programs for student affairs professionals who needed practical tools for protecting vulnerable students from systematic abuse. The legal precedents established through the Elite Four's prosecution created stronger protections for harassment victims, while increasing penalties for systematic abuse that relied on institutional indifference and victim isolation to achieve success. Emma's case demonstrated that comprehensive documentation and strategic response planning could overcome even significant privilege and family connections when criminal behavior was sufficiently well documented and legally prosecuted. The community recognition that Emma received for her courage in confronting systematic harassment included awards from civil rights organizations, victim advocacy groups, and law enforcement agencies that understood how her individual action had created broader protections for vulnerable populations throughout the region. Her example inspired other victims to seek help and fight back against abuse that they had previously endured in silence due to fear of retaliation or disbelief from authorities. The mentorship relationships that Emma developed with other harassment victims created networks of support and advocacy that extended far beyond individual cases to encompass systematic approaches to violence prevention and community protection. Her guidance helped other victims transform their experiences from sources of trauma into motivation for protecting others who faced similar challenges and threats. The speaking engagements that Emma accepted at universities, conferences, and community events focused on the intersection between individual preparation and community responsibility, emphasizing that personal safety required both practical skills and systematic changes to institutional policies that had previously failed to protect vulnerable populations adequately. Her presentations combined tactical advice with policy advocacy that created comprehensive approaches to harassment prevention. The book that Emma eventually wrote about her experience at Riverside State University became required reading for student affairs professionals, law enforcement officers, and community advocates who needed practical guidance for recognizing and responding to systematic harassment and abuse. Her work provided both individual survival strategies and institutional reform recommendations that could protect entire communities from predatory behavior. The foundation that Emma established later in her career focused on providing scholarships and self-defense training for students from vulnerable backgrounds who faced harassment and discrimination based on their economic status, family background, or perceived social position within elite academic environments. The foundation's work honored her father's legacy while extending his values of service and protection to new generations who needed similar support and advocacy. The legacy of Emma's Memorial Day confrontation with the Elite Four continued to influence campus culture and community safety programs decades after the original incident, as subsequent generations learned that systematic harassment could be defeated by people who possessed sufficient preparation, courage, and strategic thinking to fight back effectively when fighting became necessary for survival and protection of others. The quiet scholarship student who had simply wanted to honor her father's memory had become a catalyst for institutional changes that protected countless others from systematic abuse and harassment that authorities had previously failed to address adequately. Emma's story proved that individual courage could create community transformation when combined with proper preparation, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to protecting others who lacked the capabilities to defend themselves effectively. The memorial dress that had been targeted for destruction became a symbol of dignity and resilience that inspired others to refuse intimidation from those who believed privilege justified cruelty. Emma's decision to fight back when fighting became necessary had created ripple effects that continued to protect vulnerable populations long after her original confrontation had ended, demonstrating that sometimes the most profound changes began with one person's refusal to accept injustice silently. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.